The Russia-Ukraine war has now entered a decisive phase. Perhaps the outcome of this bloody conflict could well be decided in the next 2 to 3 weeks. The simple fact is that Ukraine had at long last launched its much advertised counteroffensive in the first week of June. It had prefaced this offensive by drone strikes on Russian cities and also by unconventional operations by so-called Russian partisans on the border areas in terms of pinprick raids. These were designed to draw attention away and try and force Russia to defend its territories in the Belgorod region and other places and thereby divert troops. Having done that, they blew up the Nova Kharkova dam. What was the purpose of blowing up this dam? In our analysis, the purpose was that the Russians were planning possibly their counteroffensive towards Odessa. If they planned to attack across the Kherson, across the Dnieper river in the Kherson front, then this entire flooding makes that kind of an operation absolutely next to impossible. So this could be one of the rationales for blowing up the dam, which they have of course utilized fully to propaganda purposes. Both Ukraine is blaming Russia for blowing up this dam, whereas Russia is making counter accusations on Ukraine for the same. Now, the main offensive of the Ukrainians came in the Zaporizhzhia front. That is where it was highly anticipated. The move of the Ukrainian strategic reserves in terms of their brigades, which had been doing training in the United Kingdom and in the rest of Europe. This movement of these strategic reserves was picked up by the Russian Kandor radar satellite, which they had launched on 27th of May, primarily to focus on this Ukrainian offensive. Now, this has less than 1 meter resolution. It can see through cloud, fog, rain, night and day, and to that extent has increased the battlefield transparency for the Russians by many orders of magnitude. So they picked up the move of these strategic forces towards Zaporizhzhia, and they were well prepared for the Ukrainian attack that came. The Ukrainian attack was launched by about 6 mechanized brigades and 2 tank battalions, which included the Leopard tanks, the newly acquired Leopard tanks from Germany. Now, the Russian defenses here are in 5 to 6 layers. They have sowed mines or planted mines extensively, and they have been covering all approaches with their UAVs, smaller UAVs, that is your drones, and these drones pick up enemy movement and then they direct standoff artillery, heavy artillery fire onto these assaulting troops. Even the drones are used to cause casualties to the tanks and armored vehicles, as we have seen in Russian videos that have been released. The simple fact is that over about a week, this entire Ukrainian much heralded counteroffensive has failed to make any penetrations even in the forward zone. You leave alone reaching the first tier of defenses, even in the forward zone they have failed to make penetration. The Russians have reverted to their divisional organization. Please don't forget that they had also gone and followed the American pattern of brigades groups. But after the experience of last year, they have reverted to the organization, the standard organization of the division. And these divisions have proved effective. And not only did they stop the Ukrainian counteroffensives, but whatever gains they had made, they counterattacked and they have pushed them back in the Zaporizhzhia sector. So the main offensive in the Zaporizhzhia sector has so far drawn a complete blank, and the Russians claim to have inflicted 3,000 casualties in terms of personnel, and they claim about 38 to 40 kills of tanks and Bradley vehicles. The tanks, like I said, included the Leopard tanks. Now, the simple fact is that the Ukrainians, you must understand, have about 70,000 troops deployed in the Bakhmut sector. Where they were driven out of Bakhmut city itself by the Wagner group. They still have about the largest concentration of Ukrainian troops is not in Zaporizhzhia, but in the Bakhmut sector, which is over a 60-kilometer front. So the highest density of Ukrainian troops is in Bakhmut, where they launched local offensives, and they claim to have made modest gains. The only gains that the Ukrainians are talking of is in the Bakhmut sector, where they say they have taken 3 to 4 villages on the flanks of Bakhmut. That means they are trying to surround Bakhmut in this localized offensive there. But their main offensive, which was by their strategic reserves, trained in the United Kingdom and Europe and equipped with Leopard tanks and Bradleys, was in the Zaporizhzhia sector, where they have failed to make any headway. This is about 50,000 troops. Let's not forget that. So the simple fact is, by any cold logic of calculation of comparative force levels, after the Russian mobilization, it was difficult to understand what gains the Ukrainians hope to make with these very limited force levels. The fact is, last year when they had launched their counteroffensives in Kherson and Kharkiv, the Russians by that time had not mobilized, even done partial mobilization. The Russians had attacked with 150,000 troops. A Ukrainian army that at the start of the war was 250,000 troops and expanded to about 450,000 troops. I mean, this made complete nonsense of the standard military calculus that for attack you need at least 3:1 superiority. And if you are attacking in highly built up terrain, then you need 10:1 more or less. So it was a miracle. Whatever gains the Russians made was despite this, because they were relying heavily on their technology, heavily on their artillery firepower to make the difference. But it has been clearly and painfully apparent that technology cannot make up for serious deficiencies and gaps in manpower. Some troops, whatever ground you capture, some troops have to hold it, and holding a 1,200 kilometer front with just 150,000 troops was a absolute invitation to problems. The Russians faced the problems in Kherson, they faced the problems even more in Kharkiv. Now, the Russians were trying to take out troops from Kharkiv to plug the Kherson offensive. And the American satellites noted that, withdrawal of troops and the vacuum that had been created in Kharkiv, and they asked the Ukrainians to muster troops and launch a quick offensive, which of course made very palpable gains or very, spectacular gains on the map, because there were no Russian troops involved. And they reached that river line. The Russians were withdrawing to the river line there. So the Russians were then forced to mobilize. Last September, they called up 300,000 reservists. Now, out of these 300,000 reservists, 80,000 were used to strengthen the defense lines. The Russians used this pause in the battle to create a continuous defense lines to secure the entire territory that they had occupied in Ukraine. That means the provinces of Luhansk, Donetsk, and also, in Zaporizhzhia area and the coastal sector. I mean, they created a continuous line, 3-tier line of defenses in the standard Russian pattern. Now, the Russian strategy was reminiscent of what they had done in the Second World War in 1943. Let's not forget that in 1943, both the Russians and the Germans were poised for major offensives. As a very cold, calculated decision, the Russians decided to let the Germans attack first, absorb their offensive, inflict heavy casualties, and then switch to their own counteroffensive. And they had succeeded very well in this endeavor. So they repeated this strategy here in Ukraine. They waited deliberately for the the Ukrainian counteroffensive to start, and they have more or less, at least in the Zaporizhzhia sector, decimated the initial probing attacks. It remains to be seen what forces the Ukrainians have or what forces they can again employ, because these are very heavily prepared defenses, heavily mined, and any penetrations in these will come at a very heavy cost of men and material. Do the Ukrainians have that capacity? I mean, that is highly, highly doubtful. They, like I said, made modest gains in the Bakhmut sector, but retaking Bakhmut, the built-up area, would call for, we know the problems the Russians had in that, despite their heavy preponderance of firepower, so that remains a no-go. Now, once the Russians have countered or absorbed or decimated the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and they have inflicted the heavy share of casualties, they are likely to switch to their own counteroffensive. What are the options the Russians have for this counteroffensive? The Russian counteroffensive options are three. One is to attack towards Odessa, secure the last Ukrainian port, thereby deny Ukraine access to the sea. This will, has already curtailed the Ukrainian GDP by 45 to 50%. And with that, Ukraine would have very serious problems of viability as a nation state per se. The second Russian option for attack is towards, the Kharkiv area, which they had to secede, or which they had to give up last September in the face of the sudden Ukrainian counteroffensive there, and they had already thinned that area out. So to secure their border territories in Belgorod and other places, the Russians will in all probability try and retake Kharkiv to secure their own borders. The last option is Kiev. The Russians could make a dash for Kiev once again. Kiev is also heavily defended. The dash may not be as fast as it was last time, but I think if the Russians do go for Kiev, they will presage it with heavy firepower application, standoff firepower application, and they will also have to now throw in their air power, which for some reason they have been holding back so far, because I think they are preserving it in case of any NATO intervention, when they'll have to almost fight a do or die battle. So now the three Russian options, to sum up: Odessa, Kharkiv, Kiev. It remains to be seen which option they would adopt. If they want to play safe, they might just try and push forward from Bakhmut towards Krasnovarsk and the other depth areas, and secure the whole of what is left of the Donetsk province. But these are the Russian options, for which they had, as I said, mobilized 300,000 reservists. They have also had their new tranche of 140,000 the call-ups, with what they call up every year for their mobilized troops that come into the Russian army every year. They come for a 2 years period. The last tranche had been now withdrawn and has been demobilized, but a new Russian tranche of not reservists but new recruits is also going to be available. So the Russians could launch their offensive with about 300,000 to 400,000 troops, which is a significant number. They have started prefacing their shaping operation in terms of heavy drone attacks, cruise missile attacks, tactical ballistic missile attacks on the Russian cities, primarily Kiev and of course Kharkiv and Lviv and the others, but they have been hitting this. They have been hitting the Ukrainian ammunition depots, fuel depots, and all reserves which the Ukrainians would need to launch their counteroffensive. They have been particularly striking that. Their strategy for attacking the Kiev was by using heavy concentrations of drones. The Iranian Shahid drones were used to swamp the Ukrainian defensive, to mask the actual attacks coming from the cruise missiles and the ballistic missiles. Please don't forget that the Shahid drones are not very lethal. I mean, they carry smaller payloads. But the fact is, when there are about a swarm of Shahid drones which are used to mask the attack of the more dangerous cruise missiles, Iskander missiles, and the Kinzhals, the hypersonic missiles, the Russians have therefore depleted heavily the Ukrainian surface to air missile weaponry or air defense means. Their strategy was to try and exhaust these by repeated attacks. The strategy also was to hit the Patriot batteries that the Americans had supplied, and the Russians claimed to have destroyed one of these Patriot missile batteries, which cost $1 billion, and there are also claims that they have damaged the other. Now, each of these Patriot batteries cost $1 billion. Now, there were some Ukrainian officials that had, before the start of the the Ukrainian counteroffensive, were asking for 50 to 60 Patriot missile batteries before they could launch their counteroffensive. Now, each of these cost $1 billion, so we can imagine, the American capability to supply Ukraine at these massive scales, because the Ukrainians are burning up ammunition, they are burning up air defense missiles, they are firing at a very, very rapid kind of a rate and depleting whatever has been sent to them. The American and the NATO capability to keep supplying the Ukrainians is a question mark, especially in terms of artillery ammunition. The Russians have switched to a wartime economy. They are now churning out, their drones, they are churning out their surface-to-air missiles, they are churning out, their artillery ammunition now in the millions. And the artillery ammunition is what will make a particular difference in this war, because as per ORSA analysis and studies, 45% of the tank casualties, etc., and casualties to heavy weapons and equipment have been inflicted by the artillery, not by drones, not by anti-tank guided missiles and the other weaponry, but by artillery. The American supplied HIMARS had initially made a palpable impact by striking Russian ammunition dumps and command headquarters and their reserves of men and material. But the Russians, not much has been heard of the HIMARS thereafter, because the Russians seem to have now found out the capability to shoot down the incoming HIMARS rockets. Every now and then we hear of a magic bullet, a silver bullet, which will win the war for Ukraine. Initially, it was the TOW and the Javelin anti-tank guided missiles. Then they claimed it was the HIMARS that would, turn the tide of the battle. The simple fact is there were only 16 HIMARS supplied to Ukraine. So how much damage could they really do? How much of a decisive game changer could they be? And now the Russians have found ways to counter these missiles. Now the next game changer that is being touted very, very loudly and they are thumping the table about the F-16, that if this comes to Ukraine, it will dramatically change the course of the war and defeat Russia. I am sorry. The simple fact is that the F-16s are not, they are fourth generation fighters which came up in the 70s. They are more than 30 to 40 years old. Of course, they have been upgraded every few years, but the simple fact is they cannot be a game changer. The simple fact is, there are various types. So of how many types can you sort of send in? Different types, because mix and match that you will have to send in from various European countries, and whether their softwares will be compatible, etc. Those are some problems. The basic problem is training the Ukrainian pilots to fly these aircraft. The Ukrainian pilots are used to the MiG-29, they are used to the Russian Su-27, and their muscle memory is used to those aircraft. Now, you see, you can't produce a good, you can take a good MiG-29 pilot and make him into a poor F-16 pilot. He can't be a good F-16 pilot in the matter of a few months. It takes years to really hone up those combat skills. So, one is the problem of the pilot training. Pilot training is on in the United States, it's on in other NATO countries. But the simple fact is, even if the F-16s are put in, how effective will they be in the face of such dense air defenses? I mean, the most lethal air defense environment has been seen over Ukraine. Both, I mean, the Russians with their S-300, S-400, S-500, I mean, there is an absolutely lethal air defense environment. Even the Ukrainian with their S-300s, and now with their Patriots and other German surface-to-air missile systems, they have been inflicting very heavy damage on the air forces, on the air attacks. That is why the Russian Air Force has held back. They have launched only 200 to 300 sorties per day, and that too only in peak periods. By and large, the Russian air forces have refrained from attacking in a massive way. They have mostly used standoff attacks, which fire off the cruise missiles or the rockets from their own side of the border. They don't enter Ukrainian airspace because of the highly lethal air defense environment. So, what magic bullet do the F-16s have to survive in this very dense air defense environment? Sneak attacks are all right, but concerted air attacks which can make a difference, between defeat and victory are not, I have my doubts if they can be done in this air battle. So once again, this is a lot of propaganda hype that give us F-16s and we will win the war, give us 50 to 60 Patriot batteries and we will win the war, defeat Russia, conquer Moscow, etc., etc. I mean, these are loud claims, but very coldly, rationally analyzed, I don't see the F-16s making a difference. What else can work for Ukraine? There is talk. I mean, there is a realization in Washington and there is a realization in NATO that Ukraine is at the end of its tether. Manpower wise, it has taken losses. It cannot sustain with that meager population base, 8 million of which have fled to other countries. Even the equipment losses, I mean, though actually the original Ukrainian army has been destroyed, it's only the very massive influx of American and European weaponry which has kept Ukraine going so far. The point is, how long, without switching to a full wartime industrial mobilization, how long can the United States and the NATO allies cope up with the burn rate in Ukraine, the burn rate of weapons, equipment, ammunition? It has surpassed any conflict in the last 50 years. This is reminiscent of World War I and World War II scales of expenditure of ammunition and destruction of equipment. So, what is the option thereafter left for the Americans and the NATO to stave off a Ukrainian defeat or Ukraine under heavy pressure from Russia, which looks likely to happen once Russia fully absorbs the Ukrainian counteroffensive, dents it, inflicts losses, and then switches to its own counteroffensive. Now, that would mean a big loss of face for the Americans and for NATO. So, there is talk, one, that coalition of the willing, that NATO will put boots on the ground inside Ukraine. That is the only way Ukraine can really be saved. This is what happened in World War I. The Allies were taking heavy losses in France when the United States intervened, and that intervention turned the scales. World War II also, we all know that the Germans had conquered the whole of Europe, and then it's only in 44 that the United States intervened in a massive way. So that tilted the scales. So the only hope that Ukraine now has of so-called taking back its lands or even fighting the Russians to a standstill is NATO intervention in terms of a coalition of the willing. Hungary and Poland and Romania, sorry, not Hungary, but Poland and Romania are said to be members of this coalition of the willing who are prepared to send their troops into Ukraine. Are they prepared for the consequences? Are they prepared for the Russian retaliation? There is another talk that the American Airborne Division, which is stationed in Europe presently, could be flown in and deployed in Odessa, likely target of the Russian counteroffensive. It could be flown in towards Odessa and help the Ukrainians defend this critical port city. This would be direct American intervention in the war with Russia, which so far the United States has scrupulously avoided to prevent a sudden escalation to the nuclear level. So I don't know what has changed in that logic. The logic remains the same. Russia has 5,880 warheads, more than the United States and NATO put together. And how we can ignore the nuclear threshold in a direct clash between Russia and the United States or Russia and NATO is something that is hard to fathom. Whosoever is doing these irrational calculations is making a very risky gamble, which could lead to a massive escalation, both horizontal as primarily it could be vertical escalation in terms of the use of tactical nuclear weapons, at least to start with. And once tactical nuclear weapons are used, there is no saying which way the escalation will go. Will it lead to a spasmodic nuclear release, and that is the end of our planet as we know it? So are we prepared for those drastic outcomes in the quest for saving face? I am not very sure. Time will tell. But the simple fact is that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is now in its decisive phase. The next 2 to 3 weeks will be crucial to the overall outcome of this war. The Russians expect to be able to stymie the Ukrainian counteroffensive, decimate it, inflict heavy casualties, and then switch to their own counteroffensive. Will NATO intervene and put boots on the ground, which it has scrupulously avoided so far? Will the United States come into the fray directly? Remains to be seen. We hope and pray that better sense will prevail. We hope and pray that both sides, having exhausted themselves in the months of June, July, possibly till August, will then be more amenable to talks, to peace dialogue, to ceasefires, and to hopefully an ultimate solution. The security interests of the Russians cannot be ignored in any such dialogue. The time to initiate this dialogue would only come towards mid or end August, when both sides have exhausted their military options for the time being. You can foresee this war if there is no settlement, if there is no solution, if there is no overall bid to bring the two sides to the negotiating table and resolve the problem, then we can look forward to every 2 to 3 years, when both sides have regained their breath have rebuilt their stocks of arms, ammunition, to go for repeated bouts of fighting to change the status quo. We could then look for a continual bleeding war for decades to come. We hope that outcome is avoided. We hope that the interested parties, whether it is India, which is now the president of G20 and also of SCO, India could make or should make a bid to try and broker peace somewhere in August, September. Any effort before that would be premature, and would not come to amount to anything. China is also making efforts to broker peace, which have not succeeded so far because the Ukrainians don't trust the Chinese. So I would reckon that India is the only honest broker so far in the conflict, and both the Russians and the Ukrainians have a great amount of faith in it, and India would be the best interlocutor to try for peace. India should make a determined effort to try and usher in peace and stop this mad conflict which has caused heavy damage to the global economy, very heavy damage to the global economy. It's almost brought about a recession in Europe, and recession is looming on the horizon even in the United States, and banks are failing. There's a whole lot of economic distress all over the world, especially in the poorer countries, which have led to shortages of shortages of food, of fertilizer and of fuel. Energy shortages have been crippling the economies of quite a few countries, including Pakistan, including Sri Lanka, and a lot of countries in the Middle East are at the level of distress. This has to stop. This conflict must be now brought to a closure, and I would say that let the two sides now exhaust their offensive options, and their will to fight. I hope it will be drained by mid-end August, and that would be the time suitable for ushering in a peace dialogue. Thank you.